What if I told you that a moon base could have been built back in the last century, but simply wasn't? And this isn't science fiction. Engineers were actually drawing up designs, running calculations, and figuring out how people would live on the moon, long before today's projects. We've already figured out why we need the moon. We know where it makes the most sense to build a base: near the poles, close to water, in areas with near constant sunlight. But the next question is far more interesting. If it all makes so much sense, why isn't there a base yet? The answer might surprise you. Because there were too many projects: Soviet lunar trains, American base cities, inflatable modules, underground stations, even plans for industrial resource extraction. And here's the strangest part. Many of these concepts look like they were designed yesterday. So let's take a closer look. What moon bases were already proposed? How realistic they actually were? And what exactly stopped humanity just one step away from colonizing the moon? It's no surprise that people began thinking about moon bases long before space technology even existed. Stories about journeys to the moon were imagined as far back as ancient Greece. See Lucian of Samosata, and the first known idea of a permanent settlement appeared as early as the 17th century. In 1640, the third edition of John Wilkins' book, The Discovery of a World in the Moon, discussed the possibility of lunar colonies. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky speculated about lunar cities. Early pioneers of astronautics dreamed about them. And after World War II, ideas for moon bases began to multiply rapidly. In 1954, science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke proposed a surprisingly detailed concept of a lunar base: inflatable modules covered with lunar dust for radiation protection, a nuclear reactor, plankton producing oxygen, and electromagnetic cannons to launch cargo back to Earth. Rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth imagined remarkable lunar vehicles, one shaped like a caterpillar track, another balancing on a single leg with gyroscopic stabilization. The lack of knowledge about the moon's surface led to ideas that seem amusing today. For example, the hypothesis that the moon was covered by kilometers of dust inspired concepts of floating bases drifting in this dust ocean. The military didn't stay out of it either. The idea of space as a high ground, from which nuclear weapons could be dropped with impunity, sparked strong military interest in the moon. Project Horizon, developed in 1959, envisioned the first military astronauts landing on the moon by 1965. By the end of 1966, a crew of 12 would already be on active duty there. To build the base, 147 rockets would deliver 220 tons of cargo. Maintaining it would require 64 launches and 120 tons of supplies annually. The project even included defense plans against Soviet landings. At long range, the base would use unguided Davy Crockett rockets, while at close range, Soviet lunar troops would face Claymore mines modified to penetrate spacesuits. Project Lunex, finalized in 1961, proposed an underground base for 21 people. One of its most intriguing features was the landing concept, a mini shuttle mounted on a large descent stage. Looking back at these projects, it's hard not to feel relieved that ballistic missile technology advanced enough to make lunar military bases unnecessary, and that, ultimately, space became more peaceful than militarized. Let's return to civilian projects. In 1962, John Denike and Stanley Zahn published a lunar base concept in aerospace engineering. They proposed building a large base of 30 modules on a flat lunar surface, such as the Sea of Tranquility, with a total area of 1,300 square meters. The crew would consist of 21 people, powered by a nuclear reactor. Solar panels were considered, but ultimately rejected. Another concept by William Sims proposed building a base into the wall of a crater. The three-story structure would be illuminated from above, with water-filled multi-layer windows providing radiation protection. Not all designs went underground. For example, a 1964 Boeing concept featured a tall above-ground base. As the Apollo program progressed, lunar base concepts began adapting to existing spacecraft and rockets. In a 1966 proposal by Philip Culbertson, the base would grow through annual Saturn V launches, with astronauts transported in modified Apollo spacecraft. The lunar module would carry 3 people instead of 2. In 1968, Jack LaPetra and Robert Wilson proposed the MoonLab project, a subterranean base with an extensive scientific program. By 1976, a crew of 3 would work on the moon for 3 months. By 1981, missions would last a full year. By 1982, greenhouses would be added, and by 1984, the base would receive its main scientific instrument, a 1-meter telescope. At that point, the crew was expected to grow to 24 people, including 8 astronomers. The entire base would require only 37 launches. The creation of the Skylab orbital station inspired a lunar Skylab concept, and in 1971, the final project of the American Golden Age appeared. Based on Apollo and Skylab experience, North American/Rockwell designed a lunar base using modified Skylab modules. A crew of 12 would conduct extensive scientific work, including long-range geological expeditions and research in optical and radio astronomy. Despite the success of Apollo, this golden age came to an end. The Soviet lunar program also produced a serious and detailed moon-based project. Realizing that Americans would likely reach the moon first gave additional importance to long-term lunar bases. Extended missions supported by a base seemed far more ambitious than short Apollo-style visits. As early as 1962, Sergei Korolev assigned Vladimir Barmin the task of designing a lunar base. The project became known as DLB, Long-Term Lunar Base, Zvezda, and unofficially Barmingrad. It was highly detailed. First, robotic missions would survey the site. Orbiters would map the surface. Sample return missions would bring back soil. And rovers would explore the future base location directly. Then, a lunar train carrying 4 cosmonauts would land. The base modules were mounted on wheeled platforms with individual drives, allowing them to dock together and form a mobile convoy. This made it easy to assemble the base and travel across the lunar surface. The main scientific goal was lunar geology, so mobility was crucial. The full base would consist of 9 modules. Interestingly, each module had a foldable section that would deploy after landing. Each module provided about 22.5 square meters of space, and the full crew could reach 9 to 12 people. A prototype module was even tested in long-duration isolation experiments on Earth. There were also concepts for underground bases. Unfortunately, in 1974, the N-1 rocket program was canceled, leaving no vehicle capable of delivering the base. Valentin Glushko later continued working on lunar concepts under the Vulcan LEK project, using the proposed Vulcan rocket, which eventually evolved into Energia. A design for a lunar lander from that program still survives. By the 1970s, after the end of both Apollo and the Soviet lunar program, interest in moon bases declined sharply. New ideas would only reappear decades later, in the 1990s, 2000s, and today. But that's a story for another time. Thank you for watching the video on my channel Cosmo Dream.